The night Nathaniel Dawson came into the world, Stillwater lay blanketed in rain. The kind of rain that muted sirens, blurred reflections, and turned the entire town into a quiet breath held just a moment too long. It fell steadily against the windows of Stillwater General Hospital, an old building with creaking elevators and faded paint where hope often arrived shivering in the cold light of sterile rooms. In one such room, Isabel Dawson lay on the delivery bed, beads of sweat forming along her hairline. Her hands gripped the bed rails, knuckles pale beneath the tension. Labor was a rhythm she knew, but this time it was different not just in her body, but deep in her bones. She felt something coming, something heavier than pain. For months, the scans had shown something unusual. A mass, they had said. Could be fluid, could be something else. Words came and went: lymphangioma, vascular malformation, surgical risk, but nothing was certain. Only the looks exchanged between doctors. Only the way silence crept into consultation rooms like fog. She never cried. Not then. Not when they told her it might grow larger. Not when they said she should prepare for complications. Isabel was made of quiet strength. A single mother and a part-time nurse, she had learned how to survive life's cruel ambiguities. She had only one promise left to hold: she would love this child no matter the shape he took. At 3:42 a.m., in the lull between thunder and dawn, her son was born. The room did not erupt in celebration. There was no jubilant cry, no surge of relieved laughter. Instead, a hush settled a reverent, startled silence. The baby emerged, not small, but strong. His skin was warm and pink, his limbs curling instinctively against the cold. But on the right side of his neck, stretching down toward his shoulder, was a mass, flesh and fluid swollen and discolored. It was nearly the size of his head, bulbous and unnatural. Gasps were muffled. A nurse took a step back. The attending physician's face hardened into clinical control. "We need to," he began. "No," Isabel whispered. "Let me see him." The nurses hesitated, but in that moment the rules felt thin against the weight of a mother's voice. They laid the child against her chest, tentative, almost apologetic. He did not cry. Instead, he opened his eyes. And what eyes they were, dark and solemn, wide, as if absorbing every molecule of the room. They did not flutter or fidget. They stared. At Isabel. At the light. At the world he had entered. It was as if he had been born knowing something carrying a memory far older than his hours. Something ancient flickered there, not fear, not confusion, but recognition. She cupped his head, careful of the swelling on his neck. The mass was warm, pulsing gently like it had its own breath, and yet in that moment it was irrelevant. She did not see a deformity. She saw a beginning. She named him Nathaniel. Not because it meant gift of God, though it did, but because it reminded her that love need not arrive in perfect wrapping. Sometimes it comes with weight and questions and pain, and is still worth everything. Stillwater was not unkind, but it was cautious with difference. The small town had a way of tilting its head at anything unfamiliar: children, with foreign names, families who arrived with nothing odd rumors that clung to hospital corridors. Word spread fast. A baby with a tumor, they said. Poor thing. So sad. What will he even be able to do? No one asked to see him. Casseroles were left at the doorstep, but no one lingered. No one offered to hold him. Isabel did not ask them to. She carried Nathaniel wrapped in blankets, head nestled carefully in the crook of her elbow mass, protruding like a second head, a burden visible to all. But Nate, as she called him, didn't seem to notice. He looked at windows, at lamps, at the spaces where light met dust, as if he was always looking for something brighter. The first few weeks blurred together like rain against glass. Appointments, blood draws, imaging scans, doctors who spoke with sympathy but lacked hope. The diagnosis was confirmed: congenital cervical lymphangioma, non-cancerous but dangerous in its size and placement. It pressed on nerves. It impeded movement. Eventually it might compromise his ability to breathe. A pediatric specialist from Portland was called in. He reviewed Nate's chart, flipped through images, and murmured terms Isabel had stopped trying to interpret. "We can attempt debulking," he said at last. "But it's high risk, significant vascularization. The surgery may cause nerve damage paralysis. There's no guarantee of success. What happens if we do nothing?" He paused. "He'll struggle, possibly aspirate. The mass will grow. Complications will multiply." Isabel nodded. She did not cry. Instead, she went home and held her son for hours, counting his breaths like tiny promises. By 3 months, Nate could hold a rattle with his left hand. His right hand curled inward, slightly uncoordinated. When placed on a mat, he rolled only one direction, always toward the light. She took that as a sign. He did not babble like other babies, but he laughed suddenly, openly, especially when light caught the wall in strange patterns or when wind moved the curtain just enough to flicker sunlight on the ceiling. His favorite was late afternoon when golden light touched his crib. He would stare at it for minutes, mesmerized. At night, Isabel would rock him and hum lullabies without words. She found that melodies carried emotion better than language. In those quiet hours, she whispered things she didn't dare say aloud. "I don't know what your future holds, but I will walk every mile with you. You're not broken, just built different. I love your whole body, even the parts that frighten others." Stillwater's pediatric community had limited resources. By 6 months, the doctors admitted they could not proceed with surgery locally. They recommended waiting until Nate was older, stronger, maybe 2 years old. Or sooner, one doctor added softly, if complications accelerate. Isabel heard what he didn't say. If Nate began to choke, if he stopped breathing. She went home and rearranged the apartment clearing paths, moving sharp corners, preparing for a child who might never walk easily or speak normally or grow into the boy she had once imagined. But she did not despair. Instead, she began to draw. Not art, just sketches. On napkins, post-it notes, the back of bills. Simple lines, circles, images of light. It calmed her, and slowly Nate began to mimic her. His left hand would reach toward the pen press on paper, smudge colors. And every time he did, he would smile like it made sense, like creation was a language he knew. One day at the town park, a mother moved her toddler away from Nate. She did it gently, but clearly. The child had wandered over, curious, but when he pointed at the lump on Nate's neck, the mother intervened. "Let's play over here," she said, her voice tight. Isabel did not chase her. She watched as Nate, sitting on the grass, looked at the space where the boy had been. And then he looked at her almost in question. She whispered, "It's okay. They just don't see what I see." Nate grew. The lump remained a shadow of his arrival. It changed slightly firmer, more pronounced, but never disappeared. Sometimes people stared. Sometimes they pretended not to. But Nate never cried over it. Not once. He stared at light. He made shapes in dust. He hummed when Isabel hummed. And when he placed his tiny hand on her cheek, it was always with the same stillness he had at birth. Not need. Not fear. Presence. He was not here to be pitied. He was here to be. If you believe in the power of love, courage, and healing, don't forget to subscribe to Recalled by Hope for more stories like Nathaniel's. Stillwater was a town that loved neatness, not just in lawns or sidewalks, but in stories. It was the kind of place where Sunday dresses were ironed, windows washed from the inside out, and conversations leaned toward the predictable. Imperfections, when they arrived, were often swept behind closed doors or covered with polite silence. Nathaniel Dawson did not fit into Stillwater's shape. By the time he turned 2, the mass on his neck had become a part of him both physically and in the town's imagination. It curved from just below his ear to the tip of his shoulder, a weight that caused his head to tilt slightly like he was always listening to something others couldn't hear. Children stared. Adults avoided. His mother walked with him down Main Street often, hoping visibility might bring familiarity. But visibility in Stillwater only meant observation, not acceptance. People didn't point or mock. They didn't ask questions. They simply turned away, eyes shifting like leaves in the wind. At the grocery store, mothers tugged their children aside with awkward smiles. "Let's give them space," they'd whisper as if the air around Nate required caution. At church, Isabel noticed pews slowly emptying near theirs even though no words were ever exchanged. And in the town's tiny daycare center, 2 parents requested that their children be moved to a different group for emotional safety. Isabel heard everything that wasn't said. She became an expert at interpreting silences, how long they lasted, how quickly they followed eye contact, how they thickened when Nate laughed too loudly or reached for someone's sleeve. She learned to dress him in soft turtlenecks that obscured the worst angles of the swelling. She bought sketchbooks and filled them with images of smiling animals, warm houses, and circles of light, so many circles of light. At home, she never spoke of the looks, the withdrawal, the careful distance others kept. But sometimes at night, when Nate was asleep, she would place her hand gently against the side of his neck and whisper, "You don't have to change." They do. Nate didn't speak in sentences. He sang in syllables, made sounds that mirrored the world-trained bird's wind. His communication was not verbal but vibrant, expressed in hums and movements in how he traced sunlight across the carpet with his finger like it was sacred. He liked to sit beside windows often with a crayon in hand. He didn't draw anything specific, just motion waves of color loops and orbits as if his body needed to release what words could not carry. Isabel bought crayons in bulk, letting the fragments pile in jars like colored gravel. "He's an abstract artist," she would say with a smile that didn't always reach her eyes. At 3 years old, Nate began attending the local preschool twice a week. The classroom was painted in cheerful colors, lined with alphabet posters and bins of plastic toys. But it was also filled with soft judgments. Covert glances, hesitant playdates that never materialized. During circle time, no one wanted to sit next to him. During recess, he wandered the edges of the playground, his feet scuffing the mulch, eyes following clouds. Teachers offered gentle encouragements. "Why don't you play too, Nate?" But he preferred the quiet. Not out of sadness, but necessity. The noise of others rarely included him. Then came Eli. Eli Moreno was 4 and had not spoken a single word since entering the preschool program. He had a habit of lining up toy cars by color, then knocking them over one by one with precise flicks of his fingers. Most days, he sat alone, his eyes distant, his hands always busy. One Thursday morning, Isabel dropped Nate off just as Eli was arranging colored pencils in a perfect arc across the table. Nate walked in slowly, dragging his sketch pad under one arm. He looked at Eli. Eli didn't look back, but instead of turning toward the window like usual, Nate pulled out a yellow crayon and sat beside him. For 20 full minutes, neither child spoke. Nate drew loops. Eli drew lines. Their movements never overlapped, but neither moved away. The teachers watched quietly, unsure whether to intervene or simply let it be. From that day on, they sat together. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Nate would arrive with a new color, a new motion. Eli would respond not with words but with shades. Their art spoke where they could not. Over time, Nate began mimicking Eli's careful structures, and Eli added more curves into his lines. It was not friendship in the traditional sense. It was something older, quieter, like 2 souls who recognized each other by shape, not sound. The teachers noted the change. "They seem to calm each other," one said. "It's like they speak a shared language we don't understand." One afternoon, Isabel arrived early for pickup. She waited by the doorway watching through the glass. The room was hushed. Most of the children were in the reading corner clustered around picture books. But Nate and Eli sat by the window. Eli had drawn a large sun in orange crayon, its rays stretching beyond the page. Nate was drawing circles around it, layer after layer, like orbits, like halos. Their hands moved in rhythm, not copying, but echoing. They did not smile. They did not speak, but something in their stillness was louder than words. Isabel felt a sudden pressure in her chest, something between awe and ache. For so long, she had mourned the spaces where Nate did not fit. Now she saw that he wasn't trying to fit at all. He was building his own space, and Eli had found it. The town still looked away. Neighbors still spoke in softened tones. Parents still offered thin, worried smiles. But something shifted. Perhaps it was the way Nate and Eli began to appear in the community at the library, sitting silently side by side with notebooks open. Or at the market where they took turns pointing out colors in fruit bins. Or maybe it was the mural the preschool displayed at the spring fair, an abstract piece made entirely by the two boys. Bright lines, layered suns, circles within circles. People stopped to stare. Some said nothing. Others nodded. A few whispered to each other, but no one looked away. At home, Isabel began a new notebook, one for herself. She filled it with words, not for Nate, but for the world. Words she had swallowed, rewritten, reshaped. She wrote about shame that wasn't hers but still clung to her skin. She wrote about the fear of walking into rooms where no one said hello. She wrote about light, how Nate followed it, and how Eli seemed to draw it into being. And on one page she wrote, "If they won't make space for him, he will carve it with color and carry those like him into the center." Nate turned 4 in silence and sunlight. There was no party, but Isabel baked a cake shaped like a crescent moon, and Eli came over with his parents. Eli gave Nate a single drawing, 2 figures sitting beneath a giant yellow swirl. It looked like a sun, or a light bulb, or a portal. Nate took it without a word, stared at it, and then nodded. That night, he fell asleep clutching it to his chest. If stories of quiet courage and unlikely friendships speak to your soul, be sure to subscribe to Recalled by Hope for more journeys like Nate's. Dr. Amelia West arrived in Stillwater on a Thursday cloaked in fog. The mountains were barely visible, wrapped in the kind of mist that felt more like memory than weather. She drove with the windows cracked just enough to let in the cold, hoping it would wake something inside her that had long gone quiet. She had taken the position at Stillwater Community Medical not out of ambition, but necessity. After the fallout in Seattle, she needed air that didn't carry judgment. Small towns had always scared her too close, too observant. But now, the anonymity of distance had failed her. What she needed was slowness. Silence. Somewhere to disappear where no one knew her name, or worse, the one she had almost ruined. Stillwater didn't ask questions. They needed a pediatrician. She needed to breathe. It was a trade. Her first weeks passed in routine checkups, ear infections, immunization records. The faces of children blurred into the same sequence of sniffles and nervous giggles. Parents watched her with polite optimism. "You're new," they said, and left it at that. It wasn't until the Dawson file landed on her desk that something shifted. She had heard of the boy in passing. The town talked in euphemisms, special case the child, with the condition bless his mother, she's doing her best. She expected complications, expected hesitation. What she didn't expect was the photograph. A preschool portrait clipped to the top of the medical folder. The boy sat stiffly. His head tilted a faint smile at the edge of his lips, and the mass, unmistakable, curved from his neck like a second shoulder, distorting the natural line of his body. Amelia stared at the photo longer than she meant to, not out of discomfort, but familiarity. She had seen this before, malformations, trauma, the uncorrected, but she had also seen something else, the look in his eyes. Not pain, not shame, stillness, presence, like he understood the space he occupied and refused to shrink within it. The first time she met Nate was during a community health fair hosted at the town library. Isabel brought him in early, hoping to avoid the crowd. Nate clutched a spiral notebook covered in fingerprints and pencil marks, his other hand tucked inside his mother's sleeve. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But his eyes met Amelia's without hesitation. And Amelia, she didn't flinch. She had flinched before. Years ago, in front of a different child, a different diagnosis, a face she had tried to fix, a surgery that had gone wrong, but now with Nate, she didn't blink. She bent down to his eye level, offered her hand like she would to any other child, and said simply, "Hi." He didn't take it. Instead, he handed her his notebook. The pages were filled with color not drawings in the usual sense, but spirals, patterns, abstract impressions of light and movement. Circles layered upon circles, bursts of yellow edged with blue. A single page with a curved line in charcoal that reminded her of a heartbeat stilled mid-beat. She looked up. Nate watched her like someone waiting to be seen properly. Amelia said nothing. She flipped the page slowly, reverently. And when she looked at him again, she nodded, not as a doctor, but as someone who had also once spoken in broken shapes instead of words. Later that evening, she read through his file in full. The medical jargon was heavy. Congenital cervical lymphangioma, extensive infiltration. Surgical attempts partially aborted due to vascular complexity. Current approach monitoring. No curative plan in place. The notes from the previous pediatrician were clinical conservative. Mother remains emotionally involved but appropriately informed. Patient presents limited verbal expression but engages visually. There were no words for the boy's gaze, for his way of reading a room without words of tracing meaning through crayon and silence. And no mention at all of how in the brief time she spent near him, Amelia had felt something stir like a frequency too low to hear, but impossible not to feel. She requested to meet Isabel privately. They sat in the quiet of Amelia's office afternoon sun falling in rectangles on the hardwood floor. Isabel looked tired, but not fragile. Her face carried the calm of someone who had long accepted the weight of being misunderstood. "I want to try something," Amelia said gently. "Something new." Isabel raised an eyebrow, cautious. "New doesn't usually mean safe." "No," Amelia admitted, "but neither does waiting." She laid out her plan slowly, an experimental sequence of sclerotherapy combined with surgical mapping using newer imaging technologies. Not a promise, not a miracle, but a step forward. Isabel listened, arms crossed. When Amelia finished, there was silence. Then a whisper. "If it fails, what happens?" Amelia didn't answer immediately. She thought of her past. The child in Seattle. The operating room that went quiet too soon. The family who left with empty arms and unbearable grace. If it fails, she said, he'll still know someone tried, fully, without fear. Isabel agreed. Not because of the procedure, but because this was the first time a doctor had looked at Nate and not seen an exception. She had seen a child. A boy, a person with light behind his eyes and artwork in his hands, a boy worth trying for. The following weeks were filled with scans, prep work, consults. Amelia brought in a colleague from Portland, a radiologist who specialized in pediatric vascular anomalies. They worked together late into the evening, tracing the map of vessels beneath Nate's skin like it was a constellation waiting to be read. Nate sat through the sessions quietly. He never cried. Never asked questions, but always he watched. One afternoon, while Amelia reviewed ultrasound images on her screen, she heard a soft sound behind her. Turning, she saw Nate, notebook in hand, pointing to the monitor. She crouched beside him. He had drawn a series of arcs matching the shape of the vessels on the screen, not identical, but close, as if he understood the pattern intuitively, not scientifically. "Do you see it?" she whispered. Nate looked at her, then tapped the page twice. It was not speech, but it was understanding. That night, Amelia stood in her apartment holding a photograph she kept hidden in her desk. It was a surgical team photo, 7 years old, smiling faces, hers among them, and one child face partially obscured by bandages, a boy named Leo, the one she couldn't save. She lit a candle, not out of ritual, but to mark something, a transition, a promise renewed. As the date of the procedure drew near, tension wrapped itself around the days like gauze. Stillwater, for all its reticence, felt it too. Rumors circulated. Some parents expressed concern. Is it safe? Should someone so young be part of an experiment? What if something goes wrong? But no one asked Isabel directly, and Isabel no longer explained. She moved like someone who had already lost sleep, lost comfort, lost belonging, and survived. She focused on Nate. on his laughter when Eli visited. On the way he began drawing more suns than spirals. On the page he taped to their wall a simple sketch of a tunnel with light at the end, a small figure walking toward it. Amelia saw it and said nothing, but she understood. The night before the procedure, Amelia stood by Nate's hospital bed checking his chart one final time. The room was quiet. Isabel sat in the corner, her face unreadable. Nate held his notebook loosely. He looked at Amelia, then at the ceiling. "Do you want to draw something?" she asked softly. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into the notebook and pulled out a folded page. He handed it to her. Inside was a simple drawing. 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing before a bright doorway. The smaller one had its hand outstretched. The taller one was stepping forward. Below it, a line in pencil. "Follow me even if you're afraid." Amelia didn't speak. She just nodded. If you believe in the courage it takes to choose hope again, even after failure, subscribe to Recalled by Hope for more stories like this one. In the days leading up to the surgery, the world seemed to move in slower hues. Time became a hush that followed every footstep, every breath, every look passed between Isabel and Dr. West. There were no last-minute changes, no new medical revelations. Only waiting, and in waiting, a wait that none of them knew how to name. Nate, for his part, never asked what would happen. He wasn't told the full details, not the surgical plan, nor the risks involved. But children sense what adults try to hide. They read fear like a second language, and Nate had grown fluent in the silent dialect of glances and unfinished sentences. He didn't cry. He didn't question. Instead, he drew, more than ever before. Each morning he would sit at the small table near the hospital window with Eli by his side. Nurses gave them space. Doctors paused at the doorway, unwilling to disturb the stillness. Together the boys filled page after page, spirals, suns, tunnels of light, and finally something different. A field, golden and vast, with 2 small figures standing at its center. One with a curved shadow trailing his neck like a forgotten weight. The other straight and still hand held out, both surrounded by beams of yellow that radiated from a distant horizon. Eli had drawn the lines, but it was Nate who pressed his finger against the sky and colored it blue, then silver, then white, as if dusk had arrived and vanished in the same breath. They didn't speak, not even once. But when the drawing was done, Nate tore it gently from the sketchpad, folded it into fourths, and handed it to Isabel. She opened it slowly. "And read the words written in uneven slanted letters beneath the image. If I don't make it, give this to Eli. He should know I wasn't afraid." Her hands trembled. Not from fear, but from the quiet finality of a child accepting what none of them dared say aloud. That sometimes even the smallest hearts carry a goodbye. Isabel didn't cry that night. She sat beside Nate's bed, watching him sleep. His breath moved in quiet waves soft against the rhythm of the monitor. A storm rolled in beyond the windows, low thunder murmuring across the hills, rain tracing stories down the glass. She opened the drawer by the hospital bed and took out an envelope. Inside was a letter she had written weeks before. A letter asking for palliative care. A letter she had nearly mailed when the weight of uncertainty felt heavier than hope. She held it now like a confession, and then wordlessly tore it in half. Then again, until it no longer resembled surrender. She turned back to Nate, gently brushing his hair from his face. "You are not a story of endings," she whispered. "You are the first sentence of something I never dared to imagine." The morning of the procedure arrived without ceremony. The surgical team prepared in quiet efficiency. Amelia stood at the scrub sink watching the water run over her hands like absolution. Her thoughts returned briefly to Seattle, to Leo, to the child whose face she had never stopped seeing. But when she entered the room and saw Nate, she found something steadier. Not erasure, redemption. He looked at her, not with fear, not with doubt, but with the same gaze he had given her that first day. One of quiet trust. He handed her a folded paper, another drawing, a tunnel this time, and light at the end, a small figure walking toward it. Below it, the words, If I see the light, I'll come back with it." She pressed the paper to her chest and nodded. Inside the OR, the lights were bright and unforgiving. Nate lay still beneath the sterile drape, surrounded by the hum of machines and the steady pulse of preparation. Monitors blinked. Syringes were passed. The anesthesiologist murmured numbers, and the room entered that peculiar quiet that lives between precision and prayer. The first incision was made, and then time slowed. The vascular complexity was greater than expected. Every millimeter of tissue seemed interwoven with delicate arteries and nerves. Amelia's hands moved with the studied care tracing and cauterizing suctioning and adjusting. Her mind was still, her breath measured. They reached the mass's root, deeper than anticipated. The assistant surgeon looked at her uncertain. "We might need to stop," but Amelia shook her head. "We move forward." They proceeded, and then an alarm. The monitors screamed. Flatline. For a split second, the room froze. Then movement exploded. Compressions initiated, oxygen levels checked, crash cart called in. Amelia stepped back trembling, the sterile gloves now shaking on her hands. She heard her own heartbeat louder than the alarms. Isabel stood just outside the glass, watching, pale and unmoving. A nurse tried to guide her away. She didn't budge. Inside, Nate's chest rose and fell with the rhythm of intervention. The world narrowed to seconds. One breath, two. The silence of a heart refusing to answer. Then, as suddenly as it had ceased, a beep. Another. Rhythmic. Fragile. But there. The monitors danced back to life. And so did he. They finished the procedure with careful urgency. Not everything was removed. It couldn't be. But the primary mass was successfully excised, pressure-relieved vessels preserved. Amelia stitched the final layer in silence. Her hands steadier now, her breath deeper. She had been to the edge, and this time something had pulled her back. Nate remained sedated for hours. Isabel sat beside him, holding the drawing he had given her before surgery. The field. The two boys, the golden light. She pressed it to her heart and waited. When Nate finally stirred, it was night. The lights were dimmed and the storm had passed, and only the steady sound of machines filled the room. He opened his eyes slowly. Isabel leaned forward, brushing his hair gently. He blinked once, then reached for her hand. "It feels lighter," he whispered. She gasped. It was the first full sentence he had ever spoken. Across the hallway, Eli sat in the waiting room with his sketchpad on his knees. He hadn't drawn since Nate was taken into the OR, hadn't moved much, but when the nurse appeared and simply nodded, Eli reached into his bag and pulled out a crayon. Yellow, he drew a single sun, not the kind that sits in the sky, but one that radiates from a place just behind the heart. If you believe in the power of connection that transcends words in light found through shadow, subscribe to Recalled by Hope to follow stories that carry you home. Nate healed slowly, not in a way measured by charts or progress notes, but in quiet moments, the way his breath came easier, the way sleep returned without trembling, the way his eyes opened each morning with curiosity instead of strain. The room remained the same: white walls, steady beeping nurses in and out like the rhythm of a tide, but something in the air had changed. A stillness had lifted. The fear that once sat in the corners of the room had begun to dissolve, replaced by something softer, something like peace. Isabel stayed close, never leaving his side except to step into the hallway when the weight of her relief became too heavy to hold in silence. Sometimes she cried. Not from sorrow, but release. Other times she simply sat hand in his, feeling the warmth of a child she thought she might lose. Amelia checked in each day. She no longer wore her white coat. She came in soft sweaters and quiet eyes, pulling up a chair instead of a clipboard. She brought books about stars, stories about explorers, crayons in shades Nate hadn't seen before, like copper and dusky violet. She didn't talk about healing. She talked about becoming. And Nate, he listened. Even when he didn't respond, he listened. He had always been listening. The scar stretched from the base of his neck to the top of his right shoulder. It was pale at first, then pink, then a deeper tone of healing. It curved gently like a crescent moon left behind after a long eclipse. People saw it, and they looked longer than before, not out of pity, but wonder, because now the thing they had once feared had a shape, a history, a boundary. It was no longer a question. It was a story. When Nate returned home, Stillwater was not the same. The sidewalks were familiar. The trees had begun their slow turn toward autumn. But something in the town's gaze had shifted. Where there had been sidelong glances, there were now nods. Where there had been distance, there was space being offered slowly, uncertainly, but honestly. It began at the library. The staff had reserved a small table for him and Eli near the art shelves. A handmade sign read, "Creative Corner," reserved for 2 brilliant minds. Beneath it was a jar of crayons and a fresh sketchbook. Then the market. The local florist, a woman who once avoided eye contact with Isabel, offered Nate a sunflower. For the brightest artist in town, she said, her voice cracking slightly. And then came the invitation. From the Stillwater Arts Council. They had heard about the drawings, the spirals, the suns, the fields of light. A teacher had shared photographs. A nurse had spoken. A volunteer from the hospital had whispered about the boy who drew healing into color. They wanted to host an exhibit. Isabel hesitated at first. The thought of her son, her quiet, watchful boy, being displayed, interpreted, made into something more than he already was, felt dangerous. But Nate surprised her. He nodded. Once. Then took out a blank page and drew a door. Open. She understood. They called the exhibit "The Weight We Carried." It was held in the community center on a Saturday morning in late October. The walls were lined with framed pieces, some Nate's, some Eli's, and a few they had made together. There were no captions, only titles handwritten in soft pencil. Tunnel Without End. Hands That Don't Let Go. Before the Storm. After. And at the center of it all, the piece that had been folded and unfolded more times than anyone could count, the golden field with 2 small figures and beams of yellow that reached beyond the edges of the page. It was framed in a simple white border. Below it, the words, "We weren't afraid. We followed the light. The community came." Not in waves, but in a quiet stream that flowed steadily from morning to dusk. Parents came with children. Elderly couples held hands as they stood in silence. Teenagers stared longer than they expected. Some cried. Some touched the glass as if hoping to feel something beyond color. One visitor, a retired surgeon from Portland, stood for nearly an hour before the drawing of the curved scar. His hands never left his pockets. But before leaving, he left a note in the guest book. "Once I believed scars were signs of failure. Today, I learned they are proof of survival." Amelia arrived late in the afternoon. She didn't speak much. Instead, she wandered from frame to frame, pausing longest at the drawing Nate had given her before surgery, the tunnel, the figure, the light. She stood there as Isabel came up beside her. "He hasn't stopped drawing since," Isabel said softly. Amelia nodded. Her eyes shimmered, but she blinked the weight away. "He brought me back too," she replied. "In a way I never expected. They didn't need to say more. Some truths are better shared in presence, not words." At the end of the exhibit, a makeshift podium had been placed in the center for closing remarks. Nate was not asked to speak. No one expected it. But as the final guests began to leave, he walked slowly to the front, a small card in his hand. He climbed 2 steps, turned, and read. His voice was soft, but it held. "I was born with something heavy. It made people look away. But then someone looked closer, and someone stayed, and someone drew with me, and someone didn't run. And now, I don't carry it alone. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for not turning away." He stepped down. The room didn't erupt in applause. It stayed silent, and in that silence, something sacred moved. That night at home, Isabel tucked him in gently. His scar peeked from the edge of his pajama collar. She brushed her fingers along it, not in sorrow, but in reverence. "You're not marked by pain," she whispered. "You're marked by passage." Nate closed his eyes, and slept beneath a sky that no longer needed hiding. If stories like Nate's remind you of the light we all carry even in our broken places, subscribe to Recalled by Hope and stay connected to journeys that heal. Years passed quietly at first. Seasons changed their colors across Stillwater summers soft and golden winters pale and lingering. Nate grew into his frame slowly, like a tree learning which way to lean toward light. The scar on his neck faded in color, but not in memory. It remained curved, visible, proud. A mark of where he'd been, and more importantly, who he chose to become. By the time he was 16, Nate had stopped being the boy with the lump. People no longer whispered his name in cautious tones. Instead, they spoke of his sketches of the way he taught art at the community center on weekends, of the quiet children who found their voices not in words but in color under his guidance. He didn't need many words himself. His presence was enough. He had a gift for sitting beside those who were scared to be seen. He didn't lecture or analyze. He simply handed them a pencil, a blank page, and his attention steadfast whole, without urgency. And somehow they opened, especially the children, the ones who were different, who didn't look like the others, speak like the others, move like the others. Nate saw them, because he had once been them. Eli remained his closest friend. They never became loud about it. Their friendship didn't bloom into phone calls or long conversations. But their sketchbooks were always within reach, their rhythms synced across space. Eli became an illustrator, published, recognized, still soft-spoken. He wore the same kind of shoes every year, drank from the same green mug, and never missed Nate's birthday. Each year, he gave a new drawing, always hand-delivered, always unsigned. One year, it was two boys beneath a bridge of stars. Another, a figure reaching toward a sunrise with a scar painted in gold. They never spoke of the day of the surgery again, but they always drew about it. At 23, Nate held his first solo exhibit in New York. Not for prestige, not for fame, but for something deeper. The gallery was modest brick walls, soft lighting, and open skylight. He titled the show Silent Radiance. The works weren't loud. They didn't demand. They invited. Children with extra limbs, elders with clouded eyes. Bodies marked by birth, by accident, by time, all drawn in light. At the heart of the room hung the one piece that drew the longest stares, a scar, rendered in layers of glass and thread, beneath it a mirror, so that those who looked saw not just the scar, but themselves. On the final night of the exhibit, as the crowd thinned and the air cooled, Nate stood before the visitors to speak, not from obligation, but desire. He had written his words days before, folded and unfolded the page like a ritual. And then he read, "When I was born, people turned away. They saw a weight I hadn't chosen and assumed it would bury me. But something else happened. Someone stayed. Someone drew beside me. Someone cut the weight in half and gave me back the other side as light. Today, I don't draw because I was different. I draw because I was seen. And now I try to see others the same way. Not in their perfection, but in their presence." The audience stayed silent, then rose slowly into applause, not thunderous but tender, like wind through open windows. Afterward, Eli approached him quietly. He handed Nate a frame, a simple drawing. Two figures again, one taller, one smaller, standing beneath a tree made of spirals. In the branches, folded into shadow, was a page. Nate took the frame and turned it over. Taped to the back was a folded letter yellowed slightly with age. His handwriting, shaky, childlike. To Eli, "If I don't wake up, draw the light for me. I'll follow it home. Don't forget the field. Don't forget that I wasn't afraid. I saw it, and it was beautiful." Nate stood still. His breath caught in the quiet between then and now. He remembered writing it. He had forgotten Eli kept it. Eli smiled, briefly, then nodded and walked away. No words, just the sound of memory settling like dust into light. That night, Nate didn't sleep. He walked the empty streets of the city, the letter in his coat pocket, the sky above him cluttered with stars and noise. But in his mind, Stillwater lingered. The fields, the tunnel, the drawing taped to his wall, the silence after his first sentence, the look in his mother's eyes the day he came back. When he returned home the next week, Isabel was waiting with tea and old photographs. They sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket that had once covered his hospital bed. "Do you remember," she asked, "when you said it felt lighter?" Nate nodded. "I never told you," she whispered, "but that was the moment I stopped being afraid." They sat in silence as the wind moved through the dry grass. Then she reached into a wooden box and handed him something thin and carefully folded. The original drawing, the field, and the two boys, and the light. "I kept it," she said, "because it was the first time I knew you weren't just surviving. You were becoming." Years later, Nate opened a center in Stillwater, a place for children born into silence for parents who didn't know how to hold questions for artists who had never been told their work mattered. He called it the Lighthouse. Its motto, carved above the door, was taken from his own letter, "Draw the light for me. I'll follow it home." They came, from across town, states, oceans. Children with missing words, adults with folded grief. And through it all, Nate sat still present, steady. He never promised healing, only space, only color, only light. He lived long, not quietly, but gently, with chalk on his fingers and sunlight in his voice. And when he passed decades later, the gallery reopened for one final show. It was called The Burden He Was Born With. At its center was the same drawing, the field, the boys, the light, and beneath it a sign, "We all carry something, but if we walk together, it becomes light." If this story reminded you that even the heaviest burdens can become light when shared with love, don't forget to subscribe to Recalled by Hope, where every story is a step toward healing.